Welcome to IVF This, episode 169, IVF and Perception versus Perspective. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're all doing so well today. There's a lot of information that I want to cover in this episode, so we're going to jump straight in. I thought about separating this episode out into two different parts, but I think I got everything I wanted to include in here. But as always, if you have any questions or you feel like you want me to go into greater detail or you need help with anything that I talk about on the podcast or even things that you would like for me to talk about on the podcast, you can always reach out to me. As they say, the DMs are open, but also my email address. I do love to hear from people. I love to hear from listeners, potential clients, former clients, just people in general. So you can contact me through DMs on either Facebook or Instagram. You can also email me at hello@ivfthiscoaching.com. Maybe you want to get a call booked with me, but you don't see a time that works for you on my calendar. Just shoot me an email and we can get something figured out. But that being said, this episode is going to be pretty dense, so try and stay with me. I have a lot of notes, so I'm going to be looking at my notes to make sure that I cover all of the areas that I wanted to cover for perception versus perspective, and I hope you enjoy it. So here we go. When we hear the words perspective versus perception, we often think of them as kind of interchangeable. Maybe even we don't think about them at all, but they do have very distinct meanings and implications, right? So the world that we live in is like continuously shaped by how we see and interpret experiences, especially emotionally charged ones like the IVF or infertility journey. And so it's really important that we understand perception versus perspective. I want to share with you what they are, like clearly define them, how they're different, how one is more overall beneficial for your life and your growth and your healing, and then how we can shift from perception to perspective, right? So I've interwoven some examples in there, but we really, as always, I like to start with like defining the actual topic or the content. So let's start with perception, because I think that's where most people view, think about, and experience their life is through their own perception, right? So it refers to how we interpret the world and experiences around us, right? Filtered through emotions, biases, and social conditioning. It's immediate, not conscious, so it's unconscious, and can be colored or influenced by things like fear, frustration, hope, which is especially true during the IVF experience, right? So for instance, someone experiencing infertility or going through IVF may perceive, this has definitely been true for me, a pregnancy announcement as a reminder of our own struggles, right? I think if we got down to the bottom of why birth announcements, why pregnancy announcements, why gender reveals are so triggering for us within the infertility IVF community, it is that. It is that we are filtering that information through the lens of our own struggle, right? What we are missing, and that creates an emotional response that's very grounded in pain. In contrast, perspective is a broader, more conscious way of looking at a situation or situations. It's very often described as like taking a step back or zooming out. I think I probably refer to it as zooming out more often than not. And so while perception is really immediate, a perspective kind of invites reflection. It invites taking that step back and really thinking about thoughtfully how you would like to respond and not just react to a given situation or situations. And so within IVF, maybe perspective might look like recognizing that your friend's pregnancy doesn't diminish your own chances of pregnancy, or what is often kind of triggered, your worthiness as a parent, right? Just because your friend got pregnant or your acquaintance got pregnant or your family member got pregnant doesn't mean that they are more worthy and hence you are less worthy or anything like that, right? These are the things, that the thoughts and the experiences that we have that color the way in which we experience and engage in the world. So the differences to really help you guys understand what the difference is between perspective and perception. Perspective and perception, while related, serve different functions, right? And how we process and interact with the world around us. So the distinctions come especially in those emotionally driven, emotionally charged experiences. So because of that, everything feels more magnified, right? Because IVF is such an emotionally charged experience, it's like a giant spotlight is shown on how you already perceive and move through the world, right? Most often, nothing dramatic changes about how we function in our lives, right? While we maybe have always struggled with worthiness, having a child isn't going to change our struggle with worthiness, right? That's just that's something that we think is going to happen. Like, once I have this baby or once I get pregnant, I'm going to get to think or feel a certain way, and that's just not true, right? It will just morph and shift, and the lens through which you perceive things is going to be a little bit different, but it doesn't fundamentally change. IVF and infertility hasn't fundamentally changed how you move through the world, how you think about yourself, how you think about your life. It's just shown a gigantic spotlight on all of those things. So the biggest difference between perception and perspective is that they are both, one is time sensitive, and they're both emotional reactions. So perception is this immediate emotional reaction that we have to events and experiences. It's reflective, like I said, it's unconscious, and it's really closely, deeply tied to our psychological state of mind, particularly in that moment. So going into maybe a clinic appointment first thing in the morning, it's going to, your experiences of IVF to that point, it's going to create probably a lot of anxiety for you, maybe some excitement. Our body can't really tell the difference between excitement and anxiety. Feels very similar to us, in our body, and the experience of anxiety versus excitement. But we might have this surge of anxiety, or maybe even surge of sadness, when we think about what we maybe have been through in the past, and maybe we're not feeling terribly hopeful moving forward. All of those are perceptions, right? Those immediate emotional reactions that we experience. Perspective, on the other hand, like I said, requires time and space. You don't generally get perspective right out of the gate. You get perception right out of the gate. When we talk about perspective, it's reflective and deliberate. It's intentional. It allows for the emotional immediacy of perception to be tempered and understood through the lens of context, reasoning, and that zoomed out view. Perception being reactive, perspective is maybe proactive. You could probably call it that. It's enabling you as an individual to pause and assess and to choose a more measured or deliberate response. Perspective gives us a chance to step outside of ourselves and view the situation from a more objective standpoint. And when we gain perspective, we can look at the same IVF experience, or the same experience, right, just in general, and recognize it being a part of a larger process or a step in the journey rather than a final outcome. I used to think about IVF as like the final outcome of our situation, right? So we went through 2 rounds of IVF, 3 transfers. We had overall 10 years of infertility. And I remember when we were going through IVF the first time, I almost thought of it as like the destination. That's where we're going. We're just trying to get pregnant. And then our brain does that to try to like compartmentalize and segment the activities, right? It's one of the ways that our brain tries to protect us from overwhelm, but doesn't do a great job. And so what happens is we become very fixated on the next thing that's coming, the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And that's, again, another difference between perspective and perception, is that perception tends to be much more rigid. It's influenced by, again, beliefs, automatic emotional responses, experiences, biases, conditioning. It's much more difficult to change perception once you formed it. So one of the most common examples of this like really fixed or rigid perception is that someone going through IVF, yourself or someone else, might feel that they are broken, or undeserving of either a healthy natural pregnancy, a pregnancy in general, children, all of those things, right? And so these perceptions, again, they didn't just start with IVF. You've probably had that playing in the background of your brain in some way or form throughout most of your life, but the perception persists and it shapes every aspect of the fertility journey. So then you are looking at every experience of your fertility journey through that lens of I'm broken or I don't deserve this, which just compounds our pain, just compounds our frustration and our suffering. Perspective, though, is like adaptable. It can evolve over time as we process and reflect on our own experiences. It offers flexibility in reinterpreting difficult events. It allows us to move from a place of pain to acceptance and understanding. One of my favorite kind of delineators between perception and perspective is the understanding of agency versus helplessness. Right? So I talk about agency a lot. A lot of my experiences, particularly early in the infertility and IVF journey, was that I didn't feel like I had any agency. I wouldn't have labeled myself as feeling helpless, but ultimately that was the feeling, right? So perception often places us in a position of helplessness because it is so reactionary, because it is so unconscious. And so when we react based on perception alone, especially in these kind of emotionally high stakes situation, we feel like we're constantly at the mercy of these external forces, our doctors, biology, the universe, God, all of these things that we don't have any control over nor influence over. But this perception reinforces this feeling of powerlessness, where emotions dictate responses rather than any sort of mindful action that we would want to intentionally or deliberately take. Perspective, on the other hand, is all about providing yourself agency, right? So it allows for recognition of what can and cannot be controlled. And if you've listened to me for any period of time, you've heard me say there are only three things in this world we get to control: how we think, how we feel, and what we do. That's it, right? So perspective allows for us to say, you know what, I want control of the outcome, for sure, we all do, but I don't have it. But I do have control over this, and that's what I'm going to focus on. When we talk about the agency, when I talk about like taking your power back or feeling more empowered, maybe just to even ask a question at your doctor's office, maybe you felt like you've been shut down in the past, which is your perception of asking questions or being inquisitive or just wanting to know more information. Maybe you were told you were demanding or you were just patently ignored, right? That is your perception. When you zoom out around perspective, you get to take back your agency and say, you know what, I'm paying for this service. Whether it's through insurance, private pay, maybe it's government funded if you're outside of the US, things like that. You get the opportunity to say, you know what, I am paying for this service, whether it's through taxes or whatever. I get to ask questions. I get to decide. I know that my perception previously has been based on XYZ, right? But now I get to choose. Now I get to move forward, and now I get to decide what I want to ask, how I want to know, all of that. Despite their differences, perception and perspective have a lot of commonalities in how we make sense of this world. So they're both interpretive lenses, right? Perception and perspective are both ways of interpreting and filtering our experiences. Perception is the first instinctive filter through which we process events. It's immediate, it's reactionary, all the things that I've said. Perspective builds on perception, right? So if perception is like the baseline of how you interpret things, perspective is that next step up, right? It's that intentional thinking that we want to always build on. It's reflective interpretation instead of reactive interpretation. Together, perspective and perception help create the narrative of our lives. It's just that people tend to rely very heavily, much more heavily on their perception rather than their perspective. Both influence our emotional experience. Both perception and perspective shape all all of our emotional experiences. But they just do so in different ways, right? Perception triggers the initial emotional reaction to an event, whether it's like joy, sadness, frustration, anxiety, whatever, right? Perspective doesn't necessarily like diminish the emotion, but it allows for more emotional regulation, right? It helps us to contextualize and understand these emotions, which lead to a more measured and intentional response. It doesn't take away the emotion. And I want to be really clear about that. You might be hearing me and you think, wow, perspective sounds amazing. I just want to have that. You're not going to get away from perception. Again, perception is immediate. It's involuntary. You're going to have it. It is that initial first thought. Perspective is that second thought, that intentional thought that I talk about, right? And it's really important that you understand that perception does not take away the pain, right? We can contextualize anything that we want, right? We can intellectualize anything that we want. It doesn't mean it takes away the pain. You're still going to experience pain, even though you can provide yourself perspective, okay? I didn't mean that to be a downer, but I just want to make sure that I explicitly say that. They're both cognitive and emotional processes. Perception and perspective both rely on cognitive processes, but they engage in different ways. Perception operates from an unconscious place. Perspective operates from an intentional place. They influence one another. They are deeply intertwined. The perception forms a foundation of our experiences, but perspective can help like shape how we view our perceptions, if that makes sense. Perspective, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of people, it's not just Emily, but the perspective is by far one of the most beneficial self-care, emotionally regulating, grounded things that you can develop, right? It's a skill set that you have to develop. It doesn't come born to us. If nothing else, we're instinctive creatures. So most of us aren't really ever aware that there's a difference between perspective and perception, right? We don't even think about it. We just think about our perception of the events, right? If you've ever heard the phrase "perception is reality," that's a corporate phrase that has been said, customer service facing thing that has been said, but it's not true, right? It is true for the person, I will say, but it isn't universally true, right? Because perception is a subjective view rather than an objective view. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but we want both, right? We just want to be informed of the perspective and not solely relying on the perception. And you can usually tell the difference, right? And for me, when I think about perspective versus perception is generally, by and large, going to be like from a triggered place, right? I'm not going to feel great. I'm not going to feel grounded. I'm not going to feel calm. I'm not going to feel at peace coming off of perception. When I step back, zoom out, and have the perspective, that is usually when I can find more calm, more groundedness, more peace, even if it is in the face of pain, right? So after the work that I've done, I can kind of tell the difference. And I think when we get to the section in just a minute about how to kind of engage more perspective, you're going to kind of figure out what your tells are too. So I know I can tell from my own body if I'm engaging in perspective versus perception. And I think that might be true for you guys too, although it's just going to depend on how you experience, right? I experience my emotions more than I think about my thoughts. Some people are the exact opposite. So really, I don't want you to think this is a one size fits all sort of thing. But while they're both important, perspective offers really distinct benefits that lead to just an overall general emotional, healthy emotional outcomes, right? So we tend to have more constructive responses. We tend to be more grounded when we have perspective. So first and foremost, perspective is resiliency building, right? Resiliency has always been like a double-edged sword for me because you have to go through some really hard shit in order to become resilient. But one of the benefits of perspective is that you're actually doing something with maybe some of the hardest things that you've ever experienced in your life. I know for me, going through infertility and IVF over, a decade span, the perspective that I gained around compassion and empathy and grief was life-changing. I mean, I literally pivoted my entire career path around that because it was such a perspective shift for me. And that was part of my resiliency building, right? I was able to kind of figure out how to do that and be more resilient as I gained perspective. When I tell you the emotional regulation piece cannot be overstated, it is so important because when perspective helps you regulate your emotions, it offers you a buffer between the immediate emotional response and the long-term outcome. So one of my coaches, I honestly can't remember who it was, and not that it's that important, but they would talk about perspective or responding rather than reacting as like this sacred moment, right? With a sacred moment where you get to decide whatever the decision was, right? Even if you wanted to lay in bed for 3 days, not shower and wallow while you're eating, chocolate chip ice cream, that was still your intentional choice, your deliberate choice. And you had a reason for choosing that. And so this like sacred moment, I remember very distinctly, those were the two words that were used to describe this, that sacred moment where you get to, that is where the emotional regulation lies, right? Emotional dysregulation is all about reactivity. And so when you're able to take that beat, to zoom out, step back, whatever verbiage rings true for you, that is inherently emotional regulation. And if you're anything like me, emotional regulation is one of the most difficult things for you to manage because we are such instinctive creatures, right? I know for sure, for me as a neurodivergent, emotional reactivity is like my life's work. But when I'm able to slow myself down long enough to take and have that sacred moment, I really can almost feel myself regulating just in that moment. Like I don't even have to do any more, somatic exercises or pound on my chest or bilateral stimulation, all the other things that we talk about on this podcast. I'm actually able to start the emotional regulation process just by slowing myself down to decide intentionally how I want to do things. Perspective actually improves your ability to problem solve and make good decisions because you're intentionally thinking. You're not just reacting, you're responding. I was talking about this just a moment ago, but one of the greatest things that I gained was the enhanced empathy for people experiencing similar or just people experiencing life. Life is hard, right? And so I gained from that perspective, I gained a lot of empathy. When I was able to zoom out and have that perspective, it only improved my relationships, whether it was I needed to draw specific boundaries around, how I, interacted with people or how people interacted with me, or just voicing like, this is something that I need from you, right? So often the people who are around us and supporting us during the IVF or infertility journey, they want to help. They just don't know what to do. And the world has done a really piss poor job in trying to help people understand how to help and support people, right? We'll offer platitudes, we'll offer, those one-liners, but really when you have that gained empathy, you can sit with someone in a moment of darkness or a moment of sadness or a moment of difficulty and not have to feel so uncomfortable because you've kind of zoomed out and you can see, oh, I remember when I was going through something similar to this, I didn't actually need anyone to do anything but just sit with me, right? I remember one thing that someone said to me that was so incredibly impactful one time. They were like, we don't even have to say anything. I can just sit with you. And that's what we did. Because when people are around you, you feel like you have to entertain them, right? That's perception. Oh, they're here. I have to entertain them and talk to them. Perspective is zooming out like, oh, they're just here to be with me, right? And then just, again, I'm going to the overall improved emotional well-being that you get from shifting from perception to perspective. So how? I've done a lot of talking, and I know I need to wrap it up. I'm coming up on the 30-minute mark, but I would be remiss if I did not talk to you about how to shift, right? It is gradual. It's not going to happen overnight. It is an ongoing process of intentional effort. That doesn't mean that it's like this slog that you have to get through. It's going to be like, oh, I did a really good job finding perspective on this. Oh, I just lived in perception all day for this, right? Nobody bats 1,000. That's not a thing. You're not going to do it perfectly. Drop your expectations all the way to the floor. Really, it's just kind of like a process of seeing what works for you, right? For me, one thing that really works is sometimes I have to physically take a step back, like move my feet and my body backwards as like a signal to my brain is like, oh, I need to take a step back, right? Not just figuratively, but intellectually, emotionally, give myself that moment of pause before I react. It doesn't happen all the time. I will still react to things, and I've been practicing gaining perspective for a long, long time. So before I go through the list of like how you can build out perspective, I want to make sure that you understand it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be gradual. You're going to have hits and misses and triumphs and victories. And it's going to feel like you're just like throwing a dart at a dartboard in the dark. You don't even actually know for a little bit. And then you'll start learning more about yourself as your perspective shifts and as it expands and widens and becomes much more easily understood, right? You can actually understand your reactions more and more the more you practice this. Okay, so you guys know that I talk about mindfulness all the time. Mindfulness at its core is developing perspective, right? So whatever aspect of mindfulness that you want to engage in, whether that's journaling, whether that's meditation, physical activity, I do a lot of perspective shifting on my runs. I run 3 to 4 days a week. And a lot of that work, even if I'm listening to music or an audiobook or something like that, a lot of that work is done inside my head during those runs. So whatever it is, you're just wanting to create a pause between the event and your response or the emotion, okay? That is the space, that sacred moment that I was talking about just a minute ago that allows for reflection, right? When we can start acknowledging the emotion, right, the event and then the emotion, we can then start asking ourselves 3 of the most powerful questions. And they seem simple, like ridiculously simple. They're extremely powerful questions, in my opinion. The first question that I generally ask myself is, what else might be true in this situation? What else might be true? There are more than one possibility. The one possibility that you're thinking of that's causing the emotional reaction, that is your perspective. When you ask yourself what might also be true, you're gaining that zoomed out lens, right? There might not be any other true or truth examples in what you're thinking about, but the fact that you've considered that there might be alternate information in what your perception is, that's how you gain perspective. An alternative to that question is, how might I be wrong? I don't tend to ask myself that question because it's the fundamental belief of Emily not being wrong. I'm wrong all the time, actually. But it really just depends on for me, what else might be true in this situation feels much more open. How might I be wrong? Doesn't feel quite as open. So that's one that I tend towards. But you might like what could I be? How could I be wrong about this, right? Another really powerful question, especially like when I'm journaling, that I'll ask myself is, how would I view this experience if I looked back a month, 6 months, a year from now, right? Just gaining that zoomed out lens. And then what can I learn from this moment that will help me in the future, right? A lot of times when I would ask myself that, the answer was just, I didn't fall down a hole and die. I got my heart broken. I'm devastated. We lost the embryo. we lost a baby, whatever, no matter the situation, no matter the experience, there is something to learn from that, right? It doesn't have to be like, I'm not suggesting that there has to be like silver linings or, a phoenix rising from the ashes out of every experience. We don't often get that. But in those moments, particularly when you're really reactive, for me, I think about this a lot whenever I get angry about something. What can I learn about myself or the situation that will help me in the future? A lot of the work that I do around cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly acceptance and commitment therapy, was just one of the largest therapeutic modalities that I pull from in my practice, focuses a lot on creating perspective. I did an entire podcast episode, this was a couple of years ago now, called Lessons from ACT, A-C-T, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. If you're interested and you like kind of how I break things down and talk about these things, I strongly encourage you to listen to that episode, because that is probably, for me, one of the most dynamic and helpful therapies that have come in the history. I love acceptance and commitment therapy, but it is often about kind of just shifting your perspective from this is what happened and this is horrible, a lot of black and white thinking, a lot of rigidity, to that perspective of maybe this could also be true, right? Maybe I'm not 100% correct, that this is the only possibility. And so even if you never get on a call with me, we never work together, if you're interested in like seeking therapy or counseling, I would strongly encourage you to look for a therapist who maybe specializes or uses the acceptance and commitment therapy modality. It's an incredible therapeutic technique, but allows for a lot of reframing, by the way, that doesn't deny or minimize your pain. It just shifts from maybe you're blaming yourself. So the reframe would be around how this horrible thing happened, but maybe it wasn't your fault, right? So that's what I mean by reframing. Compassion. If we had a drinking game for every time I talked about self-compassion, you guys would be drunk every single episode. Kindness, just being kind to yourself. Right. I had a client who, one of the sticky note thoughts, so basically a thought that you can write down and have close to you on a sticky note, was, this is hard. I don't have to make it harder on myself. Right. She wasn't saying she was an amazing person. She wasn't saying, glowing, lovingly things to herself. We weren't quite there yet. But all she was acknowledging was like, I don't have to take this out on myself. Like, it can be hard. I don't have to make it harder on myself. Finding common humanity in other people. A great example that I had just from my client a couple of days ago was how she was talking to her friend who recently announced that she was pregnant, and they were talking about Facebook posts. And my client was saying, sometimes I feel kind of triggered. Like, she wasn't blaming. It was a very pleasant, wonderful conversation. But her friend said, sometimes when you post about your grandmother and grandparents and how healthy they are, and how much you do with them and how interactive you are, and my grandparents are gone, right? That what provided a perspective shift of like, oh, this is the humanity of feeling loss and feeling pain. That's a shared human experience that we can pull from. And then last but certainly not least, it's never least, seeking or finding support that allows for external perspective, whether that's coaching or therapy, support group, something like that. Invaluable, right? I am always here. I would love to meet all of you who listen to this podcast. I know that that's not a realistic expectation, but I would invite you to find some sort of support that offers you external perspectives, not just validation. Right? We all need to be validated for sure. Validation only takes us so far, right? You want to get a little bit further and start managing those emotions, start managing those things. That's when you need the external perspective to help. Okay. I know we covered a ton of information today. We went a little bit long. I do apologize, but I hope this was as beneficial as I think it is, just understanding it. But that is what I have for you this week. Have a wonderful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.